In our headlines on this Tuesday afternoon, August 30th. Delegates from South Korea and the U.S. are meeting in Washington, D.C. to address the implications of the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act on bilateral trade, including that of electric vehicles. Meanwhile, South Korea claims it is tightening its national spending for the first time in 13 years amid soaring interest rates across the globe. The budget proposal stands at 639 trillion won. Plus, Monday's launch of NASA's historic Artemis I moon mission was postponed after failure to tackle an issue with one of the rocket's 4 engines. The next launch window is this Friday. We begin with planned talks between South Korean officials and their U.S. counterparts over in Washington, D.C. over the broader implications of a recently endorsed act that effectively eliminates subsidies for electric vehicles assembled outside of North America. Our Kim Nami starts us off.
Seoul and Washington have agreed to hold formal talks to minimize the impact of the Biden administration's newly adopted Inflation Reduction Act on South Korea's electric vehicle industry.
We have stressed that the discriminatory measures against Korean electric vehicles are unfair, and the U.S. side has not presented any disagreement on this.
The issue surfaced amid concerns that Washington's recently enacted bill will hurt Korean carmakers by eliminating tax credits for buyers of Korean EVs. The law excludes EVs assembled outside of North America from benefiting from a $7,500 federal tax break. In fact, officials from South Korean ministries of foreign affairs, trade and finance are in D.C. until Wednesday to confront their American counterparts on the matter and discuss countermeasures with Korean carmakers and battery producers located in the U.S.
We will deliver the position of Korean carmakers and the government's concern. We also plan to discuss future countermeasures between the two countries.
But hurdles do lie ahead as the Democrats crafted a law in such a short space of time ahead of the U.S. midterm elections in November. And in order for the bill to be amended or even to delay its enforcement for 2 to 3 years, there needs to be approval from both Senate and House of Representatives. South Korea's Trade Minister An Deok-keun is set to continue high-level talks on the issue during his own trip to Washington next week. President Yoon Suk-yeol could also try to tackle the issue with his U.S. counterpart at the UN General Assembly in New York next month. Kim Dami, Arirang News.
And Korea's green cars have been expanding their presence in the global market. Exports of these vehicles have hit a fresh high. Our Shin Se-byuk has more on these findings.
The value of South Korea-made eco-friendly car shipments hit an all-time high for the first 7 months of this year at $8.8 billion. According to data from the Korea Automobile Manufacturers Association on Monday, 5 South Korea-based car makers, Hyundai, Kia, GM Korea, Renault Korea, and Sangyong exported 306,000 units of green cars from January to July, up over 41% on year. Such figures were largely driven by outstanding performances in July, when almost 1/5 of the total exports for the period were reported. Over 54,000 eco-friendly cars were sold in that month alone. This is the first time that the figure surpassed 50,000. The KAMA attributed July's sharp jump to increased production as well as a resumption of car shipments following protests by the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions last month. Zooming into the numbers reported during the January to July period, by company, Hyundai led the chart, accounting for 45% of the total with almost 140,000 cars. Kia followed with a little over 130,000 units, or roughly around 43%, and Renault Korea took 12%. In terms of vehicle type, over 160,000 were hybrids, holding the biggest piece of the pie. EVs came in second with nearly 117,000 units, but saw the biggest on-year increase in export volume of any vehicle type, with 56.5%. As of August, exports of eco-friendly cars take up almost 30% of South Korea's car exports. The monthly value has been around $1 billion for 11 months in a row since September last year, when it first exceeded the 1 billion mark. Shin Se-byuk, Arirang News.
In other news, the government says it's tightening its purse strings next year for the first time in over a decade. But regardless of this intention, officials have earmarked a hefty chunk of the budget bill to ensure the well-being of the vulnerable. Our Finance Ministry correspondent Ji reports.
For the first time in 13 years, South Korea is tightening its belt for next year's budget. The Yoon administration on Tuesday proposed its first budget bill for next year of 639 trillion won, or around $474 billion at the current rate. Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho says that it's less than this year's budget, which was $503 billion once supplementary budgets are included.
Next year's budget was set with the government's aim of building a solid foundation for fiscal soundness. Taking this year's supplementary budget into account, next year's budget is less than this year's budget for the first time since 2010.
Chu added, although it's an increase of 5.2% on year from this year's initial budget, that rise is smaller than the nearly 9% rise seen this year. And once this year's supplementary budgets are added to the 2022 figures, the 2023 budget is 6% smaller. Also, the government has gone through major spending reforms to secure an extra $24 billion within the budget that's available for use. The minister said the secured funds will be used for important policy projects such as better protecting the socially vulnerable.
We will thoroughly support low-income households to ease their burdens.
The centerpiece of the bill is some $23 billion set aside for building a stronger welfare system. This includes raising the maximum basic living allowance for low-income families from the current $1,100 to $1,200 per month. The government will also provide social insurance to more people, with those with a monthly income less than roughly $1,900 being eligible. Another big slice will be used to help young people find work and housing. The government will expand job training aimed at helping people get highly preferred positions at major conglomerates. They'll provide this training to 36,000 people, up from the current 28,000. Also, some 54,000 new homes near subway stations will be supplied at affordable prices for young people. The government will also spend on innovation for small and medium-sized businesses and on helping those hit by the pandemic.
We will inject 1 trillion won to help small business owners overcome the damage caused by the pandemic, such as by reducing their debt.
Also, another 1 trillion won, or about $740 million, will be used to further develop the semiconductor industry. Despite all this spending, Chu noted, next year's budget bill has been drafted to keep rising government debt in check. With next year's budget, South Korea's total national debt to GDP ratio is expected to be around 49.8% next year, down 0.2 percentage points from this year. Ji, Arirang News.
On the health front, there's been a dramatic rise in the number of suspected flu patients here in the country, and this worrying reality is raising fears about a possible twindemic this year. Our Ising-jae has more.
The seasonal flu is back, and it's been spreading increasingly rapidly since this summer. Suspected influenza patients who showed symptoms like a cough and sore throat, along with a high fever of at least 38 degrees Celsius, increased to 4.2 out of 1,000 outpatients in the third week of August. The figure marked the highest level in 5 years.
Unlike last year, this year the number of influenza patients is increasing little by little. Originally, there weren't as many as there are now.
Experts point out that the flu virus may have arrived from the southern hemisphere and Southeast Asia, such as Australia, where the flu had spread earlier as overseas travel increased.
There's no social distancing and the herd immunity to the flu is low. Not to mention they're planning to get rid of PCR tests for inbound travelers, so the twindemic might come earlier than expected.
The so-called twindemic poses a greater threat to high-risk and elderly patients. Due to similar symptoms shown in COVID-19 and influenza, the confusion may delay proper treatment. Experts also say that with many South Koreans having been vaccinated for COVID-19, less are willing to be vaccinated for influenza. With the government set to announce its COVID-19 vaccine plans for the latter half of the year, medical experts hope it will also push for more people to get the flu vaccine this fall. 이승재, Arirang News.
North Korea has the capability to aggressively engage in biological, chemical and cyber warfare, according to a joint paper released this week by the Asan Institute for Policy Studies and the RAND Corporation. North Korea is estimated to possess 2,500 to 5,000 tons of chemical weapons. The size of its biological weapons and EMP attack abilities, however, remain unknown. Researchers add North Korea is using its nuclear weapons to deter the South Korea-U.S. alliance and is now more likely to resort to cyber attacks. In the event of a war on the peninsula, the paper claims North Korea will mobilize all its weapons to prevent the regime's collapse. And against that backdrop, South Korean and U.S. military authorities have launched Part 2 of the Uchi Freedom Shield. The drills this week include counter-offensive operations. Our Defense Ministry correspondent Bae Eun-ji reports.
For 4 days from Monday, Part 2 of the large-scale combined military training operation between Seoul and Washington got underway and will last until September 1st. The Uchi Freedom Shield exercise as a whole kicked off last Monday. With the first part of the drill completed, which focused on defending Seoul's capital area from North Korean attacks, the second part focuses on training for counterattacks to secure the safety of the capital region. For such training, the allies set different target locations in the north, but haven't disclosed where. During the second part of the exercise, South Korea and U.S. combined forces reportedly plan to conduct field training that involves shooting from attack helicopters, as well as maritime patrol operations. At a parliamentary session on Monday, Seoul's Defense Minister Lee Jong-suk said the Tunnel 3 at North Korea's Punggye-ri nuclear test site is capable of carrying out a nuclear test, but added they're not showing any unusual signs. He also added that North Korea also continues to prepare for missile launches, including its new intercontinental ballistic missiles and short-range ballistic missiles. Lee also noted that the North recently launched cruise missiles, its first missile launch in around 2 months, and stressed that the military is closely monitoring the situation in Pyongyang through cooperation with the U.S., especially during the combined training period. Bae Eun-ji, Arirang News.
Right, and that ends Part 1 of the Daily Report. In Part 2, we touch upon the facelift of Seoul's GWANGHWAMUN Square. Stay with us.
What matters?
Welcome back. GWANGHWAMUN Square in downtown Seoul recently received a major makeover. And for more on this refreshing reality, I have my colleague Song Yoo-jin here in the studio. Yoo-jin, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Sunny.
I also have Jack Barton here with us. Jack, it's good to see you again.
It's great to be here.
Right, Yoo-jin, so you recently covered the opening of the GWANGHWAMUN Square. Let's start with a few words on the actual changes at the square. What are some fresh features there?
Well, Sunny, I can just say that the GWANGHWAMUN Square has gone through a complete makeover. And this is not just a perspective from a reporter who covered this topic, but also from a citizen's perspective. Now, to talk about the fresh new changes, I think we need to delve a bit more into the square before. Before, the square was located in the middle of more than a dozen of traffic lines, which means that it was basically isolated. And also, the square was kind of surrounded by roads, all four fronts. So even though I can just say that it kind of lacked accessibility for pedestrians, and although citizens could enter the square through the crosswalk, when they entered the square, there wasn't really areas where they could rest or sit down. There was just the square itself. But now to talk about the changes, first of all, the most visible change is the size of the square. To mention the overall size, it has become more than 2 times larger than before. And the main reason is because the city removed the western road linking to the square. So it filled in the road, which is called Saejongdaero, that separated the square from the street block to its west. So first of all, it's 2 times bigger. And also, it has become much more like a park. And the reason why I mentioned this is because the city has planted more than 5,000 new trees to the square, which means that it has become much more greener. And not only the trees, but they added a lot of seats and resting areas where citizens could just sit down or even lie down. So I think that these are one of the biggest changes that the GWANGHWAMUN Square is now showing to us.
Right, that is good to know. Yoo-jin, what prompted this particular project, the redevelopment or the regeneration project for GWANGHWAMUN Square?
Well, to talk about, for those who are not really familiar to what GWANGHWAMUN is actually the largest and the main gate of the Gyeongbokgung Palace. And so GWANGHWAMUN has been existing in our country since the late 14th century, the Joseon dynasty. But actually the square, it first opened in 2009, which was 13 years ago. And it was part of then and current Seoul City Mayor Oh Se-hoon's urban renaissance project to kind of regenerate and renovate the city. And after it opened in 2009, the square has been receiving some feedback for improvement. And to share you guys what the feedbacks are, there were some feedback that the square lacked areas where citizens could actually sit down, rest, and take a breather. And the city wanted more historical spots for the square that the square could exhibit and give to its visitors. And also it wanted to make it more accessible to pedestrians.
Right.
Yeah, and so starting from 2016, there were like forums where citizens and experts could voice their opinion on how and what the square could be improved. And also the city started the reconstruction from 2017, which was 5 years ago. But there were actually some opinions going against the renovation. So it took some time for the city to actually embark on the project. And the official renovation and reconstruction started in November of 2020. So it took about 1 year and 9 months for the new square to be open to the public. And so I think that the city tried to make the spot into a more historical and also a more civilian-friendly square.
Right. And Jack, have you been at the square following its facelift?
Yes, like most people, I've gone down and had a look, checked it out. I have to say, initially, I was skeptical. I didn't think what I heard they were planning was really going to work. And in a way, it didn't. They were talking about a kind of Central Park in New York or all these other ideas. And of course, it's not that, but it's good. It's a big improvement on what there was before. And people can access it more easily, at least from one side of the street. It's great. It's a greener area, which cools the area down. So it has a good environmental impact as well. I'd say if there's maybe a negative, it's that it's not, it still has a bit of an identity problem. I mean, that area has gone through so many transformations trying to find its identity. And they've sort of left part of the square, which the demonstrators will like, and the rest is sort of a park, but there's not really any lawns except up near the palace end. So it's not really a park either. So they've tried to make it a square and a park, and really it's neither in the end. So I fear it might not draw in people in the long time because a big part of any of these regenerations is boosting the economy of the area. And I think it's a great place for the people in the businesses to come down and have a sandwich under a tree in the daytime. It's fantastic, you know, and again, the protesters can use the square. I'm not sure it's going to draw in lots of people in the long term, other than people like myself going down to check it out and see what it looks like. But it could be tweaked further. And again, I think it is a big improvement, and with a little bit of extra tweaking, some more lawns in there perhaps with paths between, it could be something really great.
Right, so perhaps a step in the right direction.
Absolutely.
Then. And Jan-Jul, what has been the public response to the changes so far?
Well, it's been less than a month since the square reopened to the public, and as of now, I think that citizens are really enjoying and are interested about the new square. And actually, I actually have some data that can prove this. So data from the Seoul city government shows that exactly 1 week after the square was reopened, which was August 13th, a Saturday, and the number of floating population or people on foot traffic during the evening, which is 5 to 8 p.m., near the square increased by more than 11% when compared to the square was opened. And this means that around 20,000 people went by the GWANGHWAMUN Square, areas near the GWANGHWAMUN Square during this time. So I can see that now people are trying to go and take a look at the changes. And this is kind of interesting, but I somehow managed to pass by the square every week since its reopening. And every time I passed the square, there were a lot of people. People were packed. People were packing the square. And another interesting part that I kind of noticed was the visitors. They were of all ages. There were toddlers, children, there were adults, and there were even seniors. So I think that as of now, people are quite interested and are looking at the changes in a positive way.
Right, because it's new at the moment. Eugene, the GWANGHWAMUN Square, it's a very popular venue for stand-ups for journalists, reporters like yourself, and of course Jack as well. And that being said, what was it like doing your stand-up there for the GWANGHWAMUN opening ceremony, so to speak? Well,
Sonia, as you mentioned before, the GWANGHWAMUN Square is a really popular stand-up spot for reporters. And when on the day that I went to the square to cover this report, there were even other reporters from other stations who were trying to do their stand-ups. And for me, I kind of wanted to shed light on the new, fresh features of the GWANGHWAMUN Square. And also that day it was really, really hot, so our crew was like drenched with sweat, so we wanted to find a place that we could cool down. And then there was this fountain that's called a tunnel fountain. It's a fountain that is shaped like a tunnel, and you can kind of walk through it. And so our crew decided, yeah, that's the place that we're going to do our stand-up. So I did my stand-up. You guys, I think you guys both watched it, on walking out from the fountain. And so I think that was really cool in both ways, and it was really interesting. And one thing that I want to mention about this fountain is it has great historical significance. The fountain itself has 77 jets of water, and this is because this year marks the 77th anniversary of Korea's independence from the Japanese colonization. So I kind of wanted to emphasize the historical significance of the square and how much the square has changed. So yeah, I think it was kind of a good stand-up.
Right, I see. Jack, moving forward, you mentioned urban regeneration. It's a relatively new concept here in the country. Could you tell us a bit more about it and the difference between urban regeneration and urban redevelopment, perhaps?
Redevelopment is about taking blighted areas, slums, if you want, or let's say areas where people on a low income live, and essentially evicting them, knocking down the buildings, and putting up modern buildings and moving in people with a higher income. And there's no doubt it makes the city look better, but there's a lot of controversies and issues around that. We saw it leading up to the '88 Olympics in Korea, particularly Jan-Jul, that area. But we see this in every country, you know. Regeneration is something different. It's about taking an area and making it better. It's making it more economic vibrant, making it more people-friendly, usually making it greener and cleaner. And it's often about remodeling an area. So if there was an industry that's sort of flagging and there's a transition, then you come in and you regenerate that area into a new sort of area for investment and people to come. And it's about bringing people back into the city. I mean, in Seoul, between 1975 and 1995, I think downtown the population halved. So we have seen successful regeneration here. And this is just, yeah, another step in that process of really making the inner city, the business districts, which are usually a bit dull, much more vibrant.
Right, and beyond Seoul, Jack, do share with us some urban regeneration efforts elsewhere.
I think we're seeing this everywhere, all around the world, particularly with the way technology is going now. Everyone has to make this jump. We've seen big ones, of course, in Singapore, which over the past few hundred years is now 25% bigger with all of its reclamations. But in the past few decades, along the Singapore River, around Marina Bay, we've seen incredible regeneration there. It's really one of the big success stories. It's brought in millions of dollars in investment. Tourists come. It's just plus, plus, plus with no negatives. But all over the place. We used to have our headquarters when I worked for the French agency AFP in London, in Canary Wharf. That used to be a wharf. That was regenerated. It now has some of the tallest buildings in Europe. It's super vibrant. One of my favourites, though, is right here in Seoul. I know I mispronounced it, Cheongyecheon, but the stream. You know, think about what it used to look like with the flyover. It was a sewer. And the flyover was crumbling. So, okay, how do we solve this problem? We take down the flyover, we redirect the sewers, and we turn this into a beautiful stream with walkways and bicycle paths. I've watched movies down there with chairs. I've seen food festivals. And this is somewhere that does bring people in. It's not just office workers having a sandwich. It's families, children playing in the stream. And this is really what regeneration is about. I'd say that's a 10 out of 10 case of a successful regeneration in a city.
Right, and staying here in Seoul, Eugene, I understand the project at GWANGHWAMUN Square involved breathing fresh life into the square itself, while at the same time maintaining its historical significance. How was that particular task tackled?
Well, so first of all, when the city government started embarking in doing this project, their goal was to make this area that has historical significance and at the same time can serve as a place, a casual and special place for civilians. And this, by casual and special, it means a place where citizens can just relax, have something to drink or eat, and at the same time watch special cultural performances and cultural activities. And I mentioned about how there were more resting areas and more places, resting areas and places for people to enjoy during my answer for your first question. So I just want to talk more about how much of a historical significance the city tried to work on this new square. So the city is at the top of mind. It wanted to preserve and show more Korean history to the visitors. And so they kind of excavated wells, drainage systems, and walls that date back to the late 14th Joseon dynasty. And people can actually see how they look like because there's a small exhibition area near the end of the square where people can take a look at how they look like. And also I mentioned about the fountains and waterways as well. And there's a special waterway called the Waterway of History. And the reason why this is very interesting because it shows the history of Korea for the past 630 years. And what this means is that each stone is engraved with an important event that happened every year, starting from the year 1392, which was the start of the Joseon dynasty, up until this year. So just by looking at all these spots and changes, we can see that the government tried to catch two birds with one stone, preserving historical significance and also making it more convenient and comfortable for citizens to use.
Right. And Jack, how does GWANGHWAMUN Square perhaps compare to its counterparts elsewhere? I remember you mentioning earlier on that we need to have more trees there, make more lawns to make it more like Central Park.
Yeah, well, we could make it more like that. I think compared to most other squares, though, it's quite nice because it didn't begin as a traditional square, which is usually a parade ground. In the old days, soldiers and swords and bearskin hats would usually march up and down. Often they're called that, like in Warsaw, it's the parade square. They're named after their function. And if we look at the big squares, or they're not always squares, sometimes they're circles. If you look in Mexico City or Moscow, they're usually these big windswept empty places that occasionally now they still do have a parade on them, but they feel sort of soulless. There's nowhere for anybody to sit down. You do see tourists wandering over because they feel like they ought to be there and take a photograph, and maybe you can step back and get the Kremlin and a good shot, but it doesn't really feel like it has a function. So I would say that's a big plus for the square here in Seoul now, is it's not really a square anymore. It's not a big windswept place. You do have more trees. But I'd say a really nice square is St. Stephen's Green in in Dublin. And that is a square, but it is full of grass and paths weaving through and lakes. And obviously you're not going to put ponds over there in GWANGHWAMUN Square, but I think if there was some more lawn put in with the paths interspersing it, it could be a delightful place that really would bring in lots of extra tourists at least.
Right, and for the time being then, Eugene, are there any spots at the square, aside from the ones that you've mentioned, that you'd also like to personally recommend to those who have yet to visit the square? Because shame on me, I have yet to go there.
Well, Sunny, you should definitely visit the square whenever you have time. And this is kind of a really hard question because as a reporter who covered this topic, I think that every change is so meaningful and interesting. But if I could give recommendations, I think that that kind of depends on which visit, depends on the age of the visitor or what kind of visitor is visiting the square. So for example, for parents who have children, I would definitely like to recommend the fountains. There are a lot of new fountains at the square, and I actually saw a lot of kids dipping their feet into their water and splashing inside the fountain while I was passing by. And the fountains, they have really interesting themes and shapes. There's a fountain that has the shape of Hangul, which is the Korean alphabet. So for those who have children, definitely visit the fountain because this summer it's also really hot, right? And also in terms of those who want to taste Korean history, I would like to again recommend the exhibition area where you guys can see the drainage systems, the wells of the Joseon dynasty. There is also something called a media glass. It's kind of, the glass kind of acts as a screen, and on top of the glass, they feature videos showing the feats of the great king Sejong, who invented Hangul, and also Admiral Lee Sun-shin, who is another historical, very important figure of Korea. So through that media glass, you can kind of get a glimpse of, get the flow of the Korean history.
Right. Jack, GWANGHWAMUN holds symbolic significance for those here, as it's served as a venue of public gathering. And as a foreign journalist covering events here, what are your thoughts on the role taken up by this square over the years?
Yeah, I've only been covering it for about 15 years, coming into Korea initially, and it has sort of changed. It's always had that big function as an area for protest often. I've been here for the missile tests, missile launch, nuclear tests, and then there was the Sewol ferry tragedy and the protests, of course the Park Geun-hye impeachment calls, and I've seen a big change. It used to be a bleak area, and I remember the first time I was in the AFP bureau and I saw the guys going off to a candlelight vigil and they're putting their helmets on, and that's my first time here. I thought, why are you putting helmets on for a candlelight vigil? They said, well, you'll cover one and see. And sure enough, they came back covered in fire extinguisher foam. And, you know, the protests here used to be quite rowdy and it was in this bleak square. But over the years, we see the protests become more organised, more peaceful, and we see the square changing. We see the square being gentrified, and we see people with a more perhaps confidence and comfort in their country and where the country is going, and not such this feeling of tension. So it's very interesting watching the protests and the square at the same time transforming in tandem with each other.
Right, a good point right there. Eugene, let's end with a few words on some of the upcoming events at the square then.
Well, for those who are new to the square, like you, Sunny, who want to see what kind of changes were made to the square, there's actually a tour program. It's offered by civilian volunteers. And so there are two courses for this tour, history and nature. So you guys can get both tastes of the two themes. So
I'm assuming it's also in English then? There's one in Korean and English.
Well, currently it's only offered in Korean, but I hope that there will be more tours offered in English because I would like to introduce the Change Square to a lot of international tourists and visitors as well. And also for those who are interested in music, there are regular music performances every Tuesday, Thursdays, and the weekends. And just this Thursday, there's something called the Goodbye Summer Cinema Concert. Visitors who go to this concert, they can enjoy instrumental versions of popular music movie OSTs. So I think that will be very interesting and romantic. And last but not least, this Sunday is actually International Taekwondo Day. Taekwondo is the Korean traditional martial art, and to celebrate that day on Friday, there will be a special Taekwondo performance that will take place at the square on Friday evening. So for those who are interested, I hope they please check this out.
Right, I shall do that. Eugene, thank you so much for your coverage, and Jack, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
After some 6 months of resistance warfare, Ukraine is launching an offensive operation to reclaim land in the southern part of the country from Russia. Our Jan-Jul has details.
Ukraine on Monday announced a military offensive in areas across its south. The spokesperson for Ukraine's Southern Military Command, Natalia Humaniuk, told the country's public broadcaster that Ukrainian forces have started offensive actions in different directions. This major counteroffensive comes nearly 6 months after Russian forces seized parts of territory in southern Ukraine. The front lines in the south are centered on Kherson, which is a region Russia had seized back in March. It's considered a strategic gateway to the Black Sea and Crimea, and Ukraine had been aiming to cut off Russian forces there from their main supply routes. Russia's military, meanwhile, claims that Ukrainian troops suffered heavy losses during an unsuccessful attempted attack. The claims by both Ukraine and Russia, however, have not been independently verified. According to CNN, a senior U.S. military official confirmed that Washington has also seen an uptick in kinetic activity over the past few days in the Kherson region, including artillery and rockets. This comes as a team from the International Atomic Energy Agency is heading to the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine following strikes around the plant. This has heightened fears of a nuclear catastrophe in the area, while Kyiv and Moscow have been blaming each other for firing artillery at the plant. The Group of Seven's Non-Proliferation Directors Group, meanwhile, welcomed the IAEA's trip to the nuclear plant, citing concerns over the safety of the Russian-occupied plant. 이지윤, Arirang News.
Over in the U.S., NASA's ambitious moon mission has been delayed to possibly this coming Friday. The first part of the Artemis I program was set to launch this past Monday, but an engine issue led to its postponement. Our Ishihu reports.
At the Kennedy Space Center in Florida on Monday, NASA scrubbed the debut flight of its Space Launch System rocket after a series of problems with the rocket and an engine cooling problem. The space agency had planned to launch the rocket as part of what's called the Artemis program, which aims to send astronauts to the Moon and Mars. The rocket, if successfully launched on Monday, would have traveled on a trajectory toward the Moon without any astronauts on board as a demonstration. It would have carried with it what's called the Orion capsule, an exploration vehicle that can carry the space crew to verify that the vehicle is ready to take astronauts into deep space. After a 6-week test flight cruising around the Moon, the Orion capsule would have traveled back to Earth for a splashdown in the Pacific. However, the key issue on Monday was that one of the rocket's engines could not be cooled down to the correct operating temperature. The engineers tried a series of fixes before calling off the launch 2 minutes after the targeted launch time. At a news conference afterward, NASA Administrator Bill Nelson, himself a one-time astronaut, emphasized that there are millions of components to the rocket that must all be ready.
This is a brand new rocket. It's not going to fly until it's ready. And needless to say, the complexity is daunting when you bring it all into the focus of a countdown.
NASA officials said a second launch attempt was still possible as early as Friday.
Friday is definitely in play. We just need a little bit of time to look at the data, but the team is setting up for a 96-hour recycle, so they're still holding in the launch countdown configuration.
The Artemis program consists of 3 phases. The first phase will be followed by Artemis II, where NASA aims to send astronauts for a lunar flyby mission in 2024. Following that mission will be Artemis III, the program's first crewed lunar landing scheduled for 2025. 이시후, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, K-pop rewrote history at the 2022 MTV Video Music Awards this past Sunday in New Jersey, with big wins for Blackpink as well as a separate recognition for its member Lisa, BTS and 17. Our Kim Do-yeon has the highlights.
K-pop stars shined brightly at this year's MTV Video Music Awards. BTS took home their 4th consecutive Group of the Year award, beating out other prominent nominees such as K-pop's biggest girl group Blackpink and rock stars Måneskin and the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Unfortunately, BTS ARMY fan group were unable to see the septet live in action as the band did not attend this year's ceremony in person after the group announced they'd be taking a break back in June. Blackpink fans, though, were thrilled as the group won in the brand new Best Metaverse Performance category for their virtual concert in the mobile game PlayerUnknown's Battleground. And there was more from Blackpink as they took to the stage to perform their new song Pink Venom. Released just 11 days ago, the song is currently #1 on YouTube's global top songs chart. Member Lisa also picked up the Best K-pop award for her debut solo single, La Lisa. She faced tough competition from other K-pop artists like BTS, Twice, and 17. But for her many fans, it wasn't a big surprise.
Her followers on Instagram is 2x. She has 2 times more followers on Instagram than certain individual members of BTS. And so her social media power, and if you just translate that into their ability to vote online, it's not a surprise.
17, despite falling short in the Best K-pop category, did win their first award at this ceremony. The boy band surprised their fans by winning the award for the Push Performance of the Year for their song Rock With You. Push Performance of the Year is awarded to the artist who gave the best performance in last year's MTV Push campaign.
I think 17 might be the biggest K-pop boy band in the world that we don't know about or talk about enough. Last year, they had 2 albums among the top 10 best-selling albums in the world, CDs. And just this year alone, they've already had 2 albums debut in the Billboard 200 in the top 10.
Artists who won in other categories include the Red Hot Chili Peppers for Best Rock, Nicki Minaj for Best Hip Hop, and Taylor Swift's All Too Well for Video of the Year. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
The task of finding and fostering tech talent is key to further strengthening Korea's ecosystem for unicorns. That being said, our Chairman Jung shares a new platform from the corporate sector to support startups here.
Asia has become one of the most promising regions in the world for innovation. The continent was the #1 region for global venture deals in 2021, thanks to its dynamic startup companies. And South Korea last year was among the top 10 countries worldwide with the highest number of unicorns, startups that have a valuation of at least $1 billion. To further empower startups in South Korea, Microsoft has unveiled a new platform designed to help startups grow from their initial stages all the way into unicorns.
Through Microsoft Launcher, we will empower promising local startups to create a sustainable ecosystem while overcoming technical or financial barriers. We also aim to increase South Korea's role and competitiveness in the global market.
Microsoft Launcher offers more than $370,000 of benefits to startups, including free access to Microsoft's technology, tools, and resources that startups need to build and run their business. Beyond access to technology, the platform will allow entrepreneurs to innovate and grow by matching them up with mentors in the relevant industry. Small startups with less than 10 employees are given the chance to work in shared office spaces in either Seoul or Busan, with an eased burden on rent for the first 6 months. So why South Korea of all countries? The head of Microsoft Asia says South Korea possesses a huge market opportunity considering its fast-growing nature.
If you look at South Korea's history, it used to be a huge manufacturing base. Now there's innovation. Handsets, television, cars, EV. We want to help South Korean startups with there's indisputable innovation, accelerate their progresses and become businesses at scale across the world.
He added that such assistance provided by Microsoft could help accelerate progress and lead South Korean startups to become the world's driver of change in the future. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
On the medical front, better blood flow to the brain may serve to address diseases like dementia. This is the belief behind one biotech company's latest initiative. Our Jan-Jul explains.
South Korea's aging population is increasing, and with it is a rise in dementia, a disease with no cure or effective treatment. The main cause of dementia has been known to be abnormality in the beta amyloid, but recent treatments that target this amino acid have seen low efficacy. Among the hypotheses surrounding the cause of dementia, poor blood flow to the brain has also been pointed out as an important cause.
Blood circulation delivers various nutrients to each nerve cell, so reduced blood flow restricts the supply of nutrients and oxygen to the nervous system.
Now, a Korean biotech company is in the process of developing an electronic device that could help improve cerebrovascular flow. Using what's called photobiomodulation therapy, which uses light sources including LEDs and lasers, the company is developing coin-sized electronic stickers. The sticker patch is placed on the back of a patient's neck. When light is applied, the device emits visible light rays which relax the capillaries in the brain, improving blood flow to the brain.
The capillaries are relaxed by stimulating the nerve endings in the dermis or epidermis, which causes the secretion of nitrogen oxide from blood vessels inside the brain or nerve cells around lymph nodes.
The research team also added that results from a small-scale clinical trial on patients with mild cognitive impairment in the early stages of dementia did confirm significant improvement. They used a cognitive evaluation test called a K-MOCA test, a Korean version of the Montreal Cognitive Assessment.
One patient scored 20 points on the initial K-MOCA test. After the treatment, they scored 22 points. It's well known that even a single point change in the MOCA test is very difficult to achieve, so an increase of 2 points shows high efficacy.
Results also showed that this treatment improved blood flow in the frontal lobe of the brain that's related to cognitive function. It will now undergo larger-scale trials. 이은진, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. Several people were killed and over 40 injured in Iraq on Monday as a result of violent clashes in Baghdad's Green Zone. The clashes come after populist Shia leader Muqtada al-Sadr announced his retirement from politics, prompting supporters of the cleric to storm the country's parliament building. According to witnesses, security personnel in the building used live gunfire and tear gas against hundreds of protesters. Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi has since put all government meetings on hold and has asked for al-Sadr to call demonstrators away from government buildings. Hundreds of demonstrators have been camped in the area since al-Sadr's supporters stormed the building in July. Gibraltar has finally been officially listed as a city, almost 180 years after the status was originally granted. Initially listed by Queen Victoria in 1842 as having city status, the overseas British territory in the Iberian Peninsula can now formally use the title. According to the government, Gibraltar was missing from official lists from the time, but it is unclear how that happened. However, the issue was rectified on Monday when the Rock Gibraltar was added to the list of British cities. Britain first gained sovereignty over the territory after it was ceded by Spain in 1713. Musicians in Colombia have broken the world record for the biggest concert ever performed. Some 16,000 singers, children's choirs and musicians gathered in Simón Bolívar Metropolitan Park in Bogotá on Sunday to perform a range of songs, with some of the pieces leveling criticism at political and social issues. The event was organized by the Bogotá Philharmonic Orchestra to celebrate the release in June of the final report by the Truth Commission into the country's armed conflict. The commission was part of a 2016 peace deal between the Colombian government and rebel fighters to find the truth behind rights abuses over the span of 60 years of conflict in Colombia. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good Tuesday afternoon. The whole country is going to be drenched by rain until tomorrow, concentrated in central regions, with heavy rain alerts in Incheon, parts of Chungcheongdo and Gyeonggi-do provinces. And southern Gyeonggi-do, Gangwon-do, and northern Chungcheongdo provinces will see up to 100 millimeters. Strong and intense downpours at a rainfall rate of 30 millimeters per hour are expected in some regions, so please take extra precautions. Overall, skies are dark on gray, with temperatures 2 to 7 degrees cooler than the average, reaching 21 in Chuncheon and 24 in Gyeongju. And you do need to keep an eye on the typhoon Hinnam-nor, which is moving northward and might affect Jeju Island. Now, while the typhoon is in its early stages, direction changes are very possible. So be sure to check your local weather forecast, especially if you live on Jeju Island. And after the rain peters out, skies will brighten up again, raising highs to nearly 30 degrees in the capital. Now, let's take a look at the worldwide weather conditions.
That ends this edition of the Daily Report. But do stay tuned for more headlines on Arirang News. Thank you for now.